From his insane backstage brawl with Jake Paul's crew to celebrating in the most awful way after fighting Pellegrino, there's no shortage of reasons to hate Nate Diaz. Let's take a look at all the reasons the fighter has ticked people off, starting with his insane beef with Jake Paul. To understand where Nate Diaz's frustrating antics come from, you need to take a look at his past. Not only did he and his brother grow up in tough environments, they've been fighting since before the UFC was a worldwide phenomenon, at a time when certain kinds of antics were allowed because of the lack of constant scrutiny on fighters. Think of it like the Attitude Era from the WWE, a time when everything was on the table. People didn't care what kind of person you were, as long as you were bouncing heads off the canvas and keeping the entertainment money rolling. Of course, he still takes those antics too far, such as when he caused a commotion during Jake Paul's boxing match against Silva. On the night of the match, Diaz showed up to support his fellow UFC fighter and took things too far backstage, where he reportedly slapped one of Paul's team members. Reports say that Diaz wasn't kicked out of the stadium, but he was escorted out by his own security team when Paul's victory was announced, allowing him to save at least some face. Regardless, people were pretty incensed at his behavior, including Jake Paul, who called him out to fight him. Shockingly, this wasn't even the last Paul-related meltdown Diaz has had, since he recently got into a brawl with a Paul lookalike. Piling onto the list of Nate Diaz controversies, the UFC star had an arrest warrant for second-degree assault issued against him due to his April 2023 altercation with a Logan Paul lookalike. The scoop is that Diaz met Rodney Peterson, a TikTok star famous for impersonating Logan Paul, and assaulted him, putting him into a guillotine hold until he fell unconscious. On top of that, his victim suffered a head injury while falling onto the curb. This incident is particularly incendiary, even to Nate's biggest fans. There's a difference between getting into a fight with another trained brawler and choking out a random TikTok star. If Diaz is convicted, he could face up to 8 years in prison. Of course, boxers and random bystanders aren't the only people who have had enough of Diaz, since he's also raised the ire of several of his fellow UFC fighters, including the legendary Michael Bisping. Hilariously, this beef also ties back to Nate's issues with Jake Paul. Clearly, the two should just get into a ring to go at each other at this point. For his part, Bisping has been open with his admiration for Jake after his win against Silva, and his annoyance at Diaz's backstage fight with Jake, stating that Diaz should be careful about a fight with Paul, given the YouTube sensation's recent fighting record and fitness. Of course, Diaz didn't see this particular bit of wisdom as friendly advice and immediately went to Twitter to fire back against Bisping, posting a video from 2009 showing Bisping getting knocked out by Dan Henderson. The caption? "Don't hate me cause you ain't me, MB." Now, Bisping is one of the greatest to ever step into the octagon, so you'd have expected just a little more tact in Diaz's response. This kind of quick anger is nothing new from Nate, so it's no surprise that fellow fighters don't usually get along with him. At least in the case of Bisping, he kept his disrespect to the internet, which was very much not the case in his controversial celebration over Pellegrino. Diaz's win over Kurt Pellegrino was two things. First, it was a masterclass in running a submission clinic to victory, a demonstration of a fighter silencing haters by turning one of his biggest combat weaknesses into a display of dominance. And second, it was the site of one of the most controversial in-fight moments in UFC history. Coming into the fight, many believed that Pellegrino would focus on trying to bring Diaz down to the mat because of Nate's record of not being the best at handling grapples. However, the UFC legend was having none of it, eventually getting Pellegrino into a triangle chokehold, from which there was no hope for escape. Now, none of this has been controversial so far. In fact, it's just been a demonstration of Nate being an extremely skilled fighter. The problem, however, is that Nate began his celebration before his opponent even tapped, flexing his muscles, yelling out expletives, and even flashing a sizzling double finger at the audience. audience, camera, and his helpless opponent. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this is a shocking display of unsportsmanlike behavior from the younger Diaz brother, one that gave McDonald a chip on his shoulder for the rest of his life. Some people, of course, thought the whole thing was hilarious, but others just saw it as proof of everything wrong with how Diaz approaches the fighting game. And this isn't even touching on the darkest event in UFC history, one where Nate Diaz found himself front and center. That's right, we're talking about the Nashville Brawl. All the examples I've given so far have been pretty bad, but nothing encapsulates everything wrong with Nate like the infamous incident that took place in Nashville. The saga began when Jake Shields, a teammate and friend of both of the Diaz brothers, was defending his middleweight Strikeforce title in the Nashville arena. He subsequently had his celebration spoiled by Jason Miller, a fighter who had bad blood with Shields, and proceeded to enter the octagon to go at the victor, demanding a fight. Just as he began his verbal assault, the Diaz brothers decided to make things physical, jumping into the octagon and attacking Miller. What the fans in those seats saw was pure horror and spectacle, as an all-out brawl erupted within the octagon. With both Diaz brothers squarely in the center of the fight, it would surely have gone too far if Dan Henderson's team hadn't pulled the two camps apart. This incident is seen as one of the darkest in the UFC. It also explains why many fans and fighters are hesitant to give Diaz the respect that he feels he deserves. After all, the only event that even comes close in recent memory was the Conor bus incident, and McGregor's reputation has never been the same since. The dislike for him isn't even restricted to fighters and fans. The most telling thing about him is that even the UFC administration wants a piece of him sometimes. Dana White has, after all, publicly admitted to disliking him. When the big cheese of the UFC, a dude who has handled countless hotheads and divas, says he's tempted to punch you sometimes, it's a surefire indicator that your level of likability has tanked down to the ocean floor. The feud between the two has been brewing for a while, with Diaz claiming that White is holding him hostage with his UFC contract and not giving him any worthwhile fights that pay as much as he thinks he deserves. Dana, for his part, insists that the UFC has absolutely no power over Nate, stating that the organization was contractually obligated to give him 3 fights a year, and that he has personally offered multiple lucrative fights, all of which the fighter has turned down. The frustration between the two has mounted to such a degree that it might even erupt into a brawl. After all, Dana has admitted to almost getting into a fight with Nate Diaz in a public nightclub. Apparently, Mr. White was so frustrated with Nick that he drunkenly attempted to pick a fight by demanding Nick tell him what he wanted. Clearly, there isn't a lot of love lost between Nate and the rest of the UFC. Well, folks, those are all the ways Nate Diaz has rubbed people the wrong way.